Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the Maxon booth here at SIGGRAPH 2023. My name is Matthias, aka Major VFX on all the socials. We are showcasing some amazing artists from around the globe. Here we have one of our famous LA locals. Yeah, you're ultra famous. Just wait till you see his client list. It's already up there. So one of our famous LA locals here, an amazing sculptor, an all-around great guy. Give it a big round of applause for Steve Teeple.
Thank you, Matthias. Thanks, Maxon, in general, for bringing me back here. I think this is my 4th SIGGRAPH now, which is crazy. Yeah, so my name's Steve. Everyone calls me Teeps. Don't call me Teeple. That's weird, you know. But so this is me. I threw up a bunch of clients and a little bit about myself. Just so you know, I primarily do character-related things in 3D, but I do a lot of different things. And you can see I do character design, digital sculpting, concept art, visual development, building shaders and things like that, look dev. I've been getting into character art and production modeling and rigging and all that kind of technical stuff lately. And then I also do 3D printing and sculpture work. So generally across the entertainment industry, mostly my day job for the last 3 years, I've been working full-time at Strange Loop Studios, where we do concert visuals and virtual characters in Unreal Engine. So last 3.5 years have been basically fully developing characters for Unreal Engine. And yeah, some freelance clients in there, as well as music acts I've worked with. So I did put together a reel. Don't judge my editing. I don't normally make reels, but we're going to throw this one up just to show some stuff I've worked on in the last few years here. Thank you. Yeah, lots of random scatterings of things in there. I had to throw some of my 3D prints in at the end. That was for me, not for everyone else. And yeah, so some idea of some stuff I work on. So what are we talking about today? I really wanted to kind of start off this presentation talking a bit about what I think is stuff I wish I would have learned diving into ZBrush many years ago. I've been doing ZBrush work since I got into it in 2008, but I think professionally I've been using it for about 10 years now, and it's my first time giving a presentation on it, so I kind of wanted to go over some stuff that I really learned a lot from other artists and designers getting into this stuff, and I want to show a few techniques. But early on here, I wanted to start by kind of talking about, I'm often reminded when I'm learning new 3D and just software in general and creative acts in general, I think about this interview with Akira Kurosawa, the famed director of all the old samurai films and everything. And I wanted to kind of read this just because it plays into what we're going to talk about today. But he really talked about, I think, how young people today don't know the trick of it. They start and want to get to the end right away. When you go mountain climbing, the first thing you're told is to not look at the peak, but to keep your eyes on the ground as you climb. And you just keep climbing patiently, one step at a time. And if you keep looking at the top, you're going to get frustrated. And he was talking about how to write films and scripts and all that kind of stuff. But this is something that I've carried with me for a long time, and it's the idea that I think a lot of people that want to get into ZBrush are a little bit intimidated by seeing these kind of end result sculptures that you see all over the internet, right? You might see something of like Venom fighting Spider-Man, and you're like, well, how do I get to that point in this app, and how do I logically actually use this in my workflow? And you know, it's kind of a bit of that draw the circle, then draw the owl meme, right? It's kind of like you only see this end result. And so today I kind of wanted to keep that quote in the back of your mind and that kind of mentality. And the next thing I want to talk about is, I swear we're going to get into ZBrush in a second, but I wanted to talk about form hierarchy, which is something that we're not going to dive too far into this because this is more of a traditional kind of sculpting concept and classical art in general. But if you're used to design, you know, and doing sculpture, you'll look at things like primary forms, secondary forms, and tertiary forms. And if you're thinking more in a design sense, just looking at it more simplistically, big, medium, and small. And we're not going to go into too much in detail on this on the sculpting level, but I want you to think about this concept as we progress through here. And I think a lot of people, when they're diving into ZBrush especially, is that, you know, you want to subdivide something to millions of polygons, and you really want to start adding in all these details, and there's really a lot of tools to do that. And I think what this is kind of getting at is when you start with big primary shapes and you establish those first and make sure they're very rock solid, everything else just kind of builds off of that. And I think a lot of people try to jump too far forward. So it's really in line with what Kurosawa was talking about in that interview. And I think you have to be very comfortable with weird blobby stuff initially in ZBrush. And I think that's something that I had to get used to. We've all done it. And so just keep this concept in the back of your head as I'm showing some of these techniques. And the idea that we're starting with something big and then we're refining and moving those on into more of a production model, right? So let's actually get into ZBrush. So I brought a character today. You saw an older version of him in the reel. We kind of redesigned a robot that I've been working on for my studio, and he's more in the stylized manner now. This is LV. And I wanted to bring him in because he's got a lot of like hard surface shapes on his face, and we're going to kind of, that's another thing I wanted to mention is that working on a full character right away is also very intimidating, and so we should be looking at things in digestible chunks, and I think that's something any ZBrush user should do as well. And so we're going to isolate his face, and we're going to talk about these shapes. So if you can see, this is the production mesh. This has changed a little bit in the rigging phase right now, but you can see that there's actually a full low poly here with clean shapes, and there's, you know, everything's really in a nice place. And when you go to the full higher subdivision level, everything's really polished and clean, right? So how did we get to this phase, right? And I think this is something I wanted to show because we're going to show a few techniques of how you can get into this sketching form of ZBrush and bring it to something like this. If there's one thing you can take away from this entire presentation, I want you to remember in ZBrush, when you learn a few of the techniques I'm showing, you should never feel restricted or cornered in any way, technically or creatively in this app, because there's always a way out of something, and there's a million ways to tackle the same problem. And I think that's something you're going to learn by just learning a few basic techniques I'm going to show. And so I think a lot of people, when they jump into ZBrush, they're using something called Dynamesh, and that's going to be something more like this, where you're going to have this face, and you can see the poly count here is very dense. It's just almost like a voxelization, right? If you've done any VR sculpting, it's very similar to that. So this is kind of where a lot of concept designers, most people never leave Dynamesh. If you're just sculpting something to never really, if you're going to paint over it, render it, whatever it is, you never have to leave this phase generally. This is where I sketch things in, and most stuff when I stream never really leaves Dynamesh, because you can creatively, just to give you an idea of what this is, if you're not used to ZBrush, like Dynamesh, you can basically keep pulling geometry and then re-Dynamesh, and you basically endlessly can create geometry. It just keeps going and going and going. So if you look at this though, you're like, all right, this is clean and you have an idea here, but you're like, okay, how do I get these? You can come in here and try to sculpt all this really clean and get something, but you get these blobby edges, and you know, you have the idea there already. Like this is, you have the eye shape, you have the face panel, and you're like, okay, this is where a lot of people that I've worked with in ZBrush get stuck. They're like, okay, what do I do to get this to the next phase if I wanted to get this out of ZBrush? And I'm going to show a couple techniques today. This one is a little bit more involved, but it is a lot more precise. And I think this is something I use mostly on faces, human and robotic, because you have a lot of clean control. And so we're going to jump a little bit, but this technique involves using poly paint. And so, by the way, I'm also mentioning things in ZBrush that you might not know. If you're really stuck on something and you want to know more about it, just flag me after. We'll talk about it. But I'm going to assume a little bit of knowledge here. But So we're going to fill this first with white paint, and you're not going to see any difference. I have it onto here, but if you go to color and do fill object, we're just filling this with white. And essentially, we're going to switch our color by hitting V, and it's going to go to a black. And what that does is now if I go to a paintbrush, I can paint on this mesh. We're going to do one more thing. If you go up to preferences, we're going to turn off tablet, which what that's going to do is basically remove pressure sensitivity. And now we're going to hit B, and we're going to open our brush panel, and we're going to hit P, and we're going to find the paintbrush. All this is doing lets me paint solid opacity, nothing, no fade or anything with pressure sensitivity. And essentially this technique I actually learned at a ZBrush Summit, I think, 5 or 6 years ago, but I think Cedric from Chaos Masons kind of pioneered this idea, and it's been really refined now. But the idea is that you are essentially drawing over your mesh of the hard edges and almost thinking of it like drawing your topology. So you're gonna actually, I'm just gonna turn lazy mouse up a little bit, which is a great way to do this, and we're gonna lower our brush size, and you're essentially gonna go over the whole mesh of the shapes you wanna refine, and you're actually gonna just trace over these. And now I'm only doing one or so here, and we're gonna skip ahead because this is the more time-consuming part of the process, but it's where you can really think about the shapes you wanna refine. And you're essentially gonna go over all those hard edges, and we're gonna do this on the mesh on all the pieces you want. Now, you wanna make sure everything's connected, and I did a little bit of a jump ahead here where I just did this, and you can see these are not clean. You don't have to be super concerned about the cleanliness of these lines. As long as they're not intersecting with one another, it's really the main thing, unless you want them to be. And the reason we put the pressure sensitivity off is this algorithm we're about to run needs at least 3 vertices touching, so you want to make sure there's no opacity, because if something's like got a fade on it, it actually won't run this properly. So in the Z plugin menu, there's something that they added a few years back called polygroup it. And I wish we had more time to go into all this stuff, but I think polygroups is what I'm going to show a lot of today, and that's where you basically can isolate things on the mesh, right? And it's by colors. You're going to see them represented by different colors on the mesh here. I think when you get into the more advanced levels of ZBrush, polygroups are really the bread and butter of what you can do with a lot of different things, and we're going to show some basics here. But what this is going to do, if you go to this second option here, create polygroup from paint borderless, and what that's going to do is it's going to look at all those lines we just drew, and it's going to attempt to basically isolate them. Now, you're not going to see anything initially, but if we turn line off and hit Shift F to show polygroups, you can see it created, we're going to hit V and go back to the white, it created polygroups based on those drawings. So now, really quickly, we were able to like, okay, these are the shapes I want to start refining and doing something with. And this was the only real time-consuming part of this whole process, is drawing those lines out and figuring it out. Now, there are some issues that I want to show you how you can fix. Like if you notice here, there's like a few extra ones. So if you want to combine those, quick tip, to isolate polygroups, you hold Control and Shift and click on something, and it's going to isolate it. You hit it again, it's going to invert it. We're just going to click those little ones there, and we're going to invert it, and we're just going to, if you hit Control W, it basically groups whatever's visible at the time. So this is me just going in and kind of isolating groups and fixing it. Now, this didn't happen on the other side because the groups are not symmetrical. So we're going to do one last thing here, and we're going to go down to Geometry menu, Modify Topology, and we're going to do Mirror and Weld. And that's essentially just flipping everything over to the other side. So now when I Control Shift click these, symmetry, robotic face works. So now it's also done that fix. So I'm going to just do one more thing here. We're just going to isolate these groups, and instead we're going to combine those. So you can always do this after the fact. Now this is, the trick I want to show next is something that I am embarrassed to admit I learned this last year, and this has been in ZBrush for so long, and I'm going to show it because I remember when someone showed it at the ZBrush Summit, the crowd audibly gasped because it was people that were like huge nerds that didn't know this existed, and I was one of them. So if a lot of people don't realize that there's something called Spotlight, when you hit comma on your keyboard, it gives you this whole range of menus that ZBrush has, and there's a whole set of brush folders essentially that are built in, and there's a lot of really cool stuff in here to explore if you haven't played around with it. But if you use ZBrush for sculpting, when you hold Shift, it does the smooth brush, right? You're smoothing over your geometry. If you didn't know, there's actually an entire folder of alternative smooth brushes, which one I use all the time in here is called Smooth Stronger. If you have a really dense mesh, it will actually aggressively kind of smooth things. But we're going to use this one called Smooth Groups. And when you double click it, it's going to tell you, hey, this is going to replace your Shift key, and we're going to hit OK. If it lets me, all right. There, it worked. So now when you hold Shift, it says up in the top corner, you can see it says Smooth Groups instead of Smooth. And what if you're used to doing any kind of poly painting on a weird dense mesh, see how these edges are all kind of like pixelated and awful, and you're like, well, that's okay, but then like you have random geo. Well, now when we hold shift and click over this, it's the most satisfying thing in the world. I don't, like, if you've used polygroups before, like you can now go in and actually smooth out all of those group edges. And this is something that, like I said, took me way too long to figure out. And you're essentially going in and making sure all those group edges are clean. And you see it's not even perfect on everything. We still have nothing perfectly lined up. So now what we're going to do is we're essentially going to run ZBrush. And if you're using the new version of Cinema 4D, you've probably seen that additionally added, which is something that's basically auto-retopologizing something. So we're trying to do as much as possible in a procedural way here where we don't have to go in and draw polygons each by hand. And the reason we did all this kind of polygroup stuff is because when you use ZBrush, but you really define clear areas, you realize you get a lot more control and finite control over what you're doing and what you're trying to run. And I think people use ZBrush and they'll just do it on the whole model, and then they're like, well, the eyes suck and the mouth is not great because they don't have control over it. So if we turn line mode back on, you're going to see it's still a really dense mesh, and we're going to come down to the ZBrush menu, and we're going to just hit one button. It's this Keep Groups button. Also worth mentioning, if you also don't know, in ZBrush, if you're ever confused about anything and you hold control over any icon, it actually gives you a full documentation with a detail of what it does, which also amazing. So we're going to hit Keep Groups, and we're going to run default settings on this, right? And we're just going to run ZBrush. And what it's going to do is it's going to look at all those groups and individually remesh them, but it's going to keep the edges welded. And you're going to see really quickly, we're getting something more what we want, right? It's not, still a little wobbly, a little bit not perfect yet. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to hide, we're just going to isolate this eye area, and we're going to hide the eyes because we have some placeholder ones there. I'm just going to do a delete hidden, which is going to delete everything that's not being visible right now. And I'm just going to have these eyes visible here so we can see. Those are just some placeholders, so we have something referenced there. So now what can we do to make this a lot cleaner still, right? This is all, remember, we're not trying to sculpt right now. We're just trying to do this with all sliders and buttons, like just make this as automated as possible. So next thing you can do is you can actually run ZBrush again. So we're going to hit this button called half, which is essentially going to take this and try to half the amount of polygon count. Everything else is the same. We're going to hit it one more time. And you can see now it got even lower, and we're starting to get something a lot cleaner that we wanted. But no, it's not perfect yet. So we can undo that, and you can actually go to something like adapt, and you can go to the polygon count, and you can do, it's in the thousands, so we do 1, and you can just run it again, and it tries to do this whole process, right? So we get something a lot cleaner. It's not perfect geo, but what you can do now, when you have something like this, if you scroll all the way down, there's this whole menu called deformation, and there's polish by features, polish by groups, and polish by crisp edges. And what these do is allow you to, essentially if we do polish by groups and drag this slider, it's going to look at all those groups individually and try to tighten and straighten everything out. And let's say you don't like these hard edges, you can do polish by crisp edges, and it's going to flatten and round those all out. But those are just a series of sliders where you can literally just come in here and drag things around and do a little bit of groups. And another trick, which people don't seem to know as well, is if you actually wanted to do a certain area, like these eyes, if you actually mask them and then invert the mask, you can actually do this to just a specific group and run these features. So if you wanted those to be more rounded, but nothing else being affected by that, you can actually mask it, and it honors that, which is cool. So why did we do this? You know, you're getting low poly stuff. It's not perfect. We got to fix those orange shapes, but not in this demo. But the reason you do this is a great example of, we started with something that was very sketchy. You had the idea there, but you wanted to, you weren't married to the details. You were like, okay, I need something base design in there, and now I want to go in there. But the reason polygroups are so powerful is, you know, I'm going to show some stuff really quickly. If you're interested in any of this, just I can show you after. If you use the Z modeler brush now, and we come over a face and say all polygons, you know, we can extrude this whole back piece as a mask. You know, you can come in here and look at one. You can look at one piece, and you can extrude with polygroups. You know, you have all these detailed areas where you can extrude it, or you can mask this area and use the move brush and actually have full refined control over moving this independently from everything else. And you have a really clean mesh. This is what I use all the time for like armor or any kind of outfits on a character. It's really great for hard surface stuff, but it also, the same technique if you have an organic human face and you need really clean loops for animation on the eyes or mouth. Exact same technique. You're just drawing the poly paint around the mouth, you get something super clean. But and then you can get into like some more advanced stuff like dynamic subdivisions, which are essentially going to show you the mesh. I don't know why this isn't letting me click, but it's fine. But you can basically subdivide these and start doing a lot more clean things with them. You know, you can basically polish, all that kind of stuff, right? So we're gonna just go to the next technique here, because that's something where if you're not married to design, you have a low poly base now. So let's say another example. You have something like on the character we were looking at before. So if we go back to the full character, you know, he has a bunch of clothing. And another technique I wanted to show, it's basically the opposite of this one. So like that one was basically, you weren't married to the design, you want to do something clean, you want to do the full slow painting. Now let's say we look at something like his hoodie, and we're going to open it up, and let's say you have a Dynamesh that's really clean and you want these details. So we're going to show a number of techniques right now that if you're experienced in ZBrush, you might find these a little basic, but I think these are something I do every day in this app still. And so you have this design and it's fully Dynamesh, and you are like, I don't want to lose these details and I want to make it into Substance Painter, into Unreal. We want to bring it out of ZBrush, right? So I'm going to show an easier technique that is more often used, and we're going to use something called masking, which before we were poly painting our groups, and now we're going to use it with masking. So if you hold Control, you saw how I can mask something, and if you hit, we'll just turn line mode off. If you hit Control W, that will actually polygroup your masked piece. So that's another really easy technique to fix stuff on your mesh. So let's say we wanted to bring this and get this ready for UVing, baking, all the production pipeline, right? And you want to keep these design details. So we're going to show, the first step is we're basically going to do the same thing. We're going to isolate groups and basically try to figure it out how we'd want to lay it out in a baking thing. So what I'm going to do is hold Control, and I'm going to switch the masking to a lasso. And you can come in here and hold Control, and we're going to grab these sleeves. And it doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to come in with the pen and just fix some stuff. So, oh yeah, I have tablet pressure turned off. That would be helpful. You have to excuse me. There's a crazy glare on this display, so I'm trying to see what I'm painting. So we're just going to come in and actually just kind of mask over the sleeves on this character, right? And this also doesn't have to be perfect, but, and then we're going to hit Control W, and it's going to make a group. And if you remember, we still have smooth groups on, so you can come in and do the same kind of thing, cleaning up polishing those edges. And we're going to do it to a few more pieces. So we're going to do it to the hood. Oh, I turned, sorry, it's Dynameshing here. If you Control drag, it Dynameshes, and I accidentally did it by mistake. So we're going to do that. Mask lasso. It helps if you turn, if you hit P, it does perspective, and it helps to turn that off when you're trying to do side-by-side kind of isometric stuff. So we're going to grab this hood, and I'm fine with that. And we're going to smooth out those edges. And then we're going to, you know, we're going to grab the cuffs too. Because often if you were texturing something on like a clothing item, you'd probably want to do the cuffs of their own material. Because we're going to get into Substance Painter here in a little bit. And what's also, so on the hoodie itself, if you were thinking about how clothing was actually made, you would have a seam pretty much down the side here to stitch this together. And we're going to do that. So basically with really quick masks, you have essentially isolated everything on this hoodie, how we want to do polygroups, right? Before we do the next step, because this changed in ZBrush, this technique that I'm about to show you for reprojection, there's one thing we need to do before this. You see this bar at the top. It's your undo history if you're unaware, and it will basically, you can slide back on this and show full undo history. But what we need to do before we do this ZRemesher technique is you need to hold Control, and if you actually hover over the blue current state of your mesh, you're basically going to see it turn gray when you Control click on it. And what that's doing is if you hover over it, it's actually going to tell you, it's looking at your undo history of what we're currently looking at, and it's trying to save that into memory. And it's, you'll see why in a second while we're doing that, but it's just very important, and you can always undo it if you forget to do it, but you want to do that step first. Because now what we're going to do is we're going to go and run that same ZRemesher process that we were just talking about before. And now we're going to turn keep groups on. We're going to do adapt, and I usually turn the poly count. You can just do 4 for 4,000 as a test here. And I'm going to turn line mode back on so you can see it. And we'll run this pretty much default settings and just making sure it does that keep groups. So you can see now, it took those polygroups and honored them and kept it, but we got nice quads going across it. And you see that if you ran this without the polygroups, it's the same thing as before. It would really have a hard time around the sleeve corners because it didn't know where to put those quads or loops. You know, you can come in with ZModeler brush and actually refine this even further, you know, by coming in here, and if you go to this brush and actually go to insert, you could insert your own loops on where it's animating or something or bending. But this is fine for this demo. But you can see that this is where a lot of people get stuck too. They lose most of their sharp detail, right? Like you sculpted all this stuff and now you kind of just blobbed it all out with a low poly mesh. So before you had to do a really complex thing with duplicating your mesh, reprojecting the details and everything. So they made this a lot easier now. So if we actually subdivide by hitting Control D on the mesh, all we're doing is adding, we're gonna go up to 2.9 million. So that's about 5 subdivision levels. Generally 5 or 6 is about what I would go to for a high poly production mesh. So if you remember why we saved that state, if you come back up to the top in your subtool menu, there's a menu called Project, and there's a new button that was added, I think 1 version ago, called Project History now, and essentially it's going to look at that past state from before we ran the algorithm, and it's going to now reproject it back onto our mesh that we just remeshed. So you're going to see in a second, it's going to take a minute because it's about 2.9 million polygons, but I realized this was much faster on my demo computer, but all right. And see there, with almost nothing, I didn't do any cleanup on this. You can see it brought back all of our details, but what's nice about this, if we hit Shift F, you can see that it actually retained all of our subdivision levels, and we have really clean groups, but it retained all of our detail now. So that's a couple techniques you're gonna do a lot in ZBrush when you're making stuff. You're gonna sketch something in Dynamesh, you're gonna then try to clean it up with polygroups, and then try to do this reprojection to get your detail back. This is when you are essentially at a design where you don't want to change the silhouette or the base shape too much. You're basically kind of locked in, and this is where you want to take it to the next step, right? So there's one more thing we can do this. You know, if you've ever tried to do anything in Substance Painter, you need UV maps, and if you want to go into a game engine, you need UV maps. Well, we just did like 90% of the work for us. So if we go to the Z plugin menu and go to UV Master, you can hit this button down here. I suggest doing this where it's called Work on Clone. And what it does is it basically clones our subtool and brings it to its own version over here. And what's nice about this is since we already did all the polygroups, if you hit this button called Polygroups and hit Unwrap, it is essentially already looking at all of our groups that we just did. And if you hit Flatten, you can see how we already saved ourselves time by, oh, sorry, autosave's trying to go. We already saved ourselves time and basically already did our UV maps. Now this is obviously a demo. These could be a lot lower and cleaner here, but I'm just gonna turn quick save off. Hold on 1 second. And another trick, you know, because this UV packing is pretty bad here, but a lot of people don't realize if you actually go into the gizmo and hit Control and click on meshes, you can actually move around your UV islands and pack in UV Master, which a lot of people, I think, don't realize. So if you wanted to actually control these and you weren't bringing them into another app, but these are just auto UVs, they're fine. But essentially now, because we did all those polygroups, we have all this. So we're gonna go back to my plugins are over here. We're just gonna go unflatten, we're gonna hit copy UVs, and we're gonna go back to that hoodie, and we're gonna hit paste UVs. So now, pretty much not that long of a process once you learn these steps, and you have a full low poly mesh with projected details, high and low, and we have polygroups with our UVs, and you're essentially gonna go through a full character and do that, right? Piece by piece. You can decide to merge things, whatever you wanna do. So that is easy on a hoodie, but like, you know, there's a lot of pieces on a character, but it's the same technique across the board, which is another thing that I think you need to realize is that it's repeating a lot of the same techniques, a lot of polygrouping, running ZRemesher, reprojecting. You're gonna repeat those things. So now, I do want to show a few things here, and we're good on time, so I can show a few more Substance Painter vibes. So like if you wanted to take this now and bring it out of ZBrush, again, it's a challenge people tell me all the time is how do I get it out of this app and do something else? If you wanted to bring it into Cinema or Unreal or anything like that, you need to know how to do that. So if you hit Shift D and go all the way down, you're gonna go to the lowest subdivision level, and we're gonna go over a very basic baking workflow in Substance, which If you don't know what baking is, it's essentially doing the same thing we did with reprojection. It's taking this low poly mesh and it's trying to take that high poly detail and project it into a normal map. And we're going to show that on the most basic level here. So you would go and export this out as an FBX on the lowest setting, and then you would go all the way back up to the highest setting. And one side note here, this is 2.9 million polygons. My general rule of thumb on a pretty beefy computer is if it's 4 million and under, I will export it without doing anything to the mesh. I'll just let it sit there for a few minutes and export, because Substance will handle that no problem. If you have a lower spec computer and you're running into time, you would run something called a decimation on this mesh, and you would probably want to just duplicate this high poly, delete the lower polygon count and keep the high, and then you run over here to the plugins, and there's something called Decimation Master. You would pre-process it and then decimate it. And what that's going to do is it's going to take your mesh and keep all the high poly detail, but triangulate everything, and basically it could lower a 2.9 million mesh to something like 500K and retain all the detail. So that's just a side trick. We're not going to run that because that does take a minute to run that process, but if you have a lower spec computer, I often do this on high poly meshes for baking. So just a side note. So I already went ahead and exported these. You want to basically do hoodie, and if you're using Substance, a good habit to get in is doing _low, _high on all your meshes, because you're essentially going to line those up, and if you have multiple meshes at a time, it can automatically look at high versus low. So you always want to use that suffix. I use all lowercase. It works the best with that app. So we're going to open up Substance here, and I want to show some things. All right. Yes. Okay, so let's go to Painter. I'm showing this too because I have a lot of friends that watch our stream or something, and they'll ask me, like, how do you do the most basic stuff in Substance? And I think some people are still kind of confused by this workflow. I think if you work in games or VFX, this is pretty natural to you, but I think a lot of this is, I'm kind of gearing this talk towards people that are intimidated by these apps and want to get into them and work on them in their own workflow. Because everything you do in Substance, your models and everything you're working on is going to infinitely look better just on a professional level, and it's something that is very, if you're looking for work, it's very hireable to learn PBR workflows. So I'm going to do new, and right off the bat, I think this menu is also kind of confusing. So when you go to File, you're going to select your low poly mesh, right? And I just got to go to the desktop, and so you're going to always point this to your low poly, right? And document resolution, you can change this at any time. I usually default it to 4K, but Substance lets you change this at any time. It's non-destructive. The only thing on the normal map format, this next one, if you are using Unreal Engine, I would do DirectX, which is, without getting too much into this, it's basically about the green channel on your normal map. If it's flipped either direction, that's a little bit more technical than we need to get on this. But if you're using Unreal, DirectX is a good option for you. Other things you can leave, we're going to make sure auto unwrap is unchecked, because we already have UVs, and we're going to turn off import cameras. This checkbox here, use UV tile workflow. If you are an advanced user and you're someone that wants to use UDIMs, if you're in VFX or film, that would be your UDIM button. That is way beyond what we're doing in this demo, but and if you're working in games, you're never going to touch that, so it's fine. So we're going to hit OK, and all it's doing is bringing in that hoodie we sculpted before. It looks gloriously low poly and awful. It's awesome. I wanted to show one or two things in Substance that are really helpful. If you hold Shift and right-click, you're actually changing your light source in here. And something they added, if you go over here, you can actually change this environment alignment to camera now, which if you're used to it now, when you rotate your mesh, it actually keeps the lighting consistent, which is chef's kiss. Thank you, Adobe team. This is amazing. It's like the stupidest little feature that I love. And so now, how do we get that normal map, all the bakes? How do you use the cool stuff? Because if you take a mesh, if you take one of these things and you don't have any details and you just drag it on here, you're just dragging it on the low poly. And yeah, you got some cool fabric, that's great, but we want to take advantage of all of Substance power, like the procedural smart materials and all the cavity maps and all that kind of stuff. So we have to bake something, right? Substance also got a little cheeky here and did a little croissant icon for the baking now, which I think is kind of cute, but it's essentially this is your baking menu, and we're doing one object. There is some more advanced stuff I can touch on if we have time at the end here of how you do this with a full character. But so we're going to change the output size to, I always default this to 4K. This is another thing in Substance that's actually, you can non-destructively change this at any time. So if you do something in 2K and bake it, you can actually upscale to a 4K without any issue. I will also mention, unless you are using something that's extremely close to the camera, you do not need anything over 4K texture maps, in my opinion. I can't remember the last time professionally I've ever had to use 8K maps, except for on something that was very, very close for detail, and maybe rocks or something like that. But 4K is great. It will be fine for what you're doing. The only other things I'm going to check here is I do apply diffusion. And in this next thing here this is where we actually load our high poly mesh. And this can be, like, I've thrown like 10 million polygon meshes in here and it hasn't blinked. So, because what you're going to see now is it's going to take the high poly, and that's our blue mesh over here. And this is, if you haven't used the new version of Substance Painter, this is probably one of the coolest things they added. Is it's all visual now. So when we're baking, we can actually see this. You just have to guess on these numbers and look at this stuff and try to figure it out. The only thing you need to really worry about on here is the max frontal distance. And what this slider is looking at is, if you see me stretch it, it's basically the distance from the high poly to the low. And if we bring it all the way down, you can see how we start to get this red kind of like error going on. And that means it's obviously below that mesh, and it's going to have errors when it's projecting. So your main goal is to just drag this slider on the most basic level until you don't see any red. Now, the red you're seeing now is on the front interfacing meshes, which is we can ignore because it's a one-sided mesh. But you want to make sure the outside is not showing any of that red, right? And so this is taking that high poly and the low poly from ZBrush that we brought, and we're just layering them on top. I'm just going to turn anti-aliasing up, and everything else is basically default. There are some very advanced things we can get into here, but this is on the most basic level how we get that. And if we hit bake selected textures, you're going to see in real time, essentially, it's taking that high poly detail and it is now baking it onto this low poly mesh. And this is great because you can see right away, you can cancel it if it's messing up, if it's giving you bad results. But you can actually rotate around the mesh while it's trying to bake now, which has all been in the update recently, which is great. And you can see like your UV seams and everything. But what we're doing is we're calculating a normal, a world space normal, an ID map, an ambient occlusion, curvature, all these fancy maps that we don't have to do too much with. But I'm going to show you how you can take this and add procedural textures, and then you can we're going to go over a few settings on if you wanted to get it into C4D and like Redshift and Octane, or if you wanted to bring it in Unreal Engine. Those are kind of different processes, but so yeah, it's great. Now we just hit return to painting mode, and now we have what we were looking at in ZBrush. Now there are some issues that I will point out that when you get into baking, I will warn you that it's very rare that your first bake is going to be good. So it's kind of a dark art in the way that you'll find issues with your mesh. A great example on this that I left in here because I wanted to show everyone is, if you notice on the hoodie, it looks fine from the front, but since that polygon edge was so sharp and there was no beveling there, you can see when it tried to project it, if you look at an angle, it kind of jagged, angular lines there, because that's why you bevel hard edges all the time usually when you're modeling something, because it doesn't know how to project over a really hard edge. So that's why we're kind of getting that weird low poly look there. We're going to leave it in there for the demo. It's fine. But now when you have all that, you can come over to Smart Materials. We're just going to use the built-in stuff. But this is where it's nice, because now when you use something like this cloth material and you actually open it up, you can see that it's going to retain, it's going to use that high poly detail for your curvature map. And you can see that it adds dust to all the high poly details, but that's on a low poly mesh. We're still on this low poly without all this detail is being faked essentially right now, which is why, I mean, this is how any game is made. You're putting stuff on a normal map to keep the detail. But this is what's, I mean, on the most basic level, you could just drag some Smart Materials onto this and you get something that's now following your mesh, because it needed all of those maps to be able to do this stuff. And so we can get real fancy with Substance. And this is just a really basic overview of that. So first, I'm going to show, if you want to export this into something like Cinema or any other 3D app, you're going to follow the more traditional PBR workflow. Now, if you go to export textures, we're just going to use this as an example. You're going to get, they have a lot of templates here, and I believe there's actually a Redshift template in here. I will say that I normally don't use any of the preset templates, except for if I'm doing just regular PBR, I would do something like PBR Metallic Roughness. And why I do that is if you're passing these maps to any other teammate or anyone else that uses maybe the different app than you, these are universal shader maps that can be used across the board. People can adapt these to anything they want. You might run into something if you do like a Redshift one, it might only be for that. So just be careful if you're sharing with teams, that kind of stuff. And really you just pick an output format, you just say 4K, And what that's going to do is if you click on the map here, I think it includes a emissive, which you can have if you want, but there's nothing emissive on this map right now. But it gives you height, normal, metallic, roughness, base color. We're unfortunately not going to dive into all of that today, but you would plug those into the respective channels on a texture in Substance, or I mean in Octane or Redshift. So what if you want to get it into Unreal though, which is primarily what I work in, and this is actually a lot easier, and there is a preset in here if you go all the way to the bottom called Unreal Engine 4 Packed. Don't worry if you're in 5, it's the same thing. It's just the old preset. And I usually choose Targa, which is the only time I ever use that file format. That was taught to me by a game dev friend of mine that said it was the best for compression and loading into Unreal. I don't know why, but I just have good experience with it. And if you notice, we're only going to get 4 maps, and the emissive you can actually just ignore, so we're getting 3. And I actually made a slide about this because when we bring it into Unreal, since we don't have time to really dive into fully Unreal, I wanted to show this process because if you do this setup right here, you are going to get essentially one-to-one what you see in Substance Painter in Unreal, which is actually, if you've ever worked with PBR shaders, sometimes there's a lot of finessing in engines to try to make it look the way it does in Substance. This is the most basic process, and you will always get almost identical one-to-one in Unreal from Substance. And this is your base colors into your base color and your normals into your normal. Now this middle map is where a lot of people get tripped up. This is unique to game engines. It's called an ORM map, which is essentially occlusion, roughness, and metallic all layered in one image. All you have to do in Unreal is double-click that image and turn sRGB off, which is important because it's basically telling it to not, you need to separate the data from each color, right? So I made you a little helpful hint here. If anyone wants me to send this to them, I'm happy to. Red channel is your ambient occlusion, your green channel is your roughness, and your blue channel is your metallic, and it's all 3 of those maps in one combined map, which makes your life a lot easier. You only have to import 3 things. And I'm telling you, that will, all your stuff, and if it looks like it in Substance, that's going to make it one-to-one in Unreal pretty much, which is amazing. It's really simple, and once you get that, and I actually have a preset shader I built in Unreal where I just drop those maps in and it auto-points them to those proper channels. You can make your own preset. So yeah, that is on a singular object, right? Since we have a little time, I do want to open up a Substance file that has the full character. And one thing, let's see, can it open here? We can discard that. Where did I put that? Bake demo? Yeah, here we go. So this is an older version. This was the work in progress on him of a full character in Substance, and this is more like hand-painted kind of texture techniques I'm using here with a lot of using the position maps for gradients and things like that. And this is very similar to, you know, if you play any kind of like stylized video game, this is very similar to that kind of workflow. And this is kind of the work in progress on the character when it's fully textured. And you can see in like the pants here, what's nice about this is actually, if you actually go to the material and we go to base color, almost all of this is unlit right now. So I have all of the lighting actually baked into this character because I wanted a more stylized look where his shadows and his AO and everything are kind of painted in. So it's always going to look really nice from pretty much any angle you look at. With no lighting data on it, it pretty much has the same look across the board. But that's all there because of the materials we baked, like the position maps, the curvature, all that stuff is possible because all right, I have a little time, so I will show a little bit of Substance stuff here. This is like where you can come in and you can actually, you can add masks to individual layers, and then you can point it to, specific things. Like you can add a mask here, and you can point it to like the position channel that you drag in there from your baked maps, and so you can control things based on like AO, curvature, all that stuff. Okay, so if you notice though, if you're doing a full character, you want to be able to still work on these pieces separately, right? And if you notice, I have like the hands separated and the head is its own piece, the headphones. And the reason this gets a little tricky and why this workflow is gets complicated really quickly on a full character is that if you notice, like if you bring this all in as one FBX and you bake the headphones and they're overlapping on the character, if you don't separate them in these things called texture sets, you're essentially going to get like an AO pass, like a shadows where the headphones are going to be baked into this head because they're overlapping, right? So I'm going to show you a cinema trick that actually is a very crucial step here where we can isolate texture sets, and that's what these are over here. And how you actually make those, if we open cinema, I loaded the character up, right? And you can see all of his individual meshes. It doesn't matter how many separated there are. Like you could have 100 pieces. This is a very simple technique, and all we're going to do is open the shader editor, and we're going to double click and make a default shader. It looks like it's making redshift. We're going to go and default material. I guess it's redshift, but for this demo, whatever. But why my cinema knowledge is lacking? Is it just materials? Oh, it's render settings. Oh, okay. Yeah, it's really not that big of a deal because I'm not actually exporting out here. But all you're doing, pretend that's a normal shader. You're just double clicking it. All you have to do is assign a flat color to this shader. It can be any color you want, and you're basically going to name this shader what you want to isolate. So let's name it cloth. And all you're going to do is you're going to make multiples of these shaders, and you're actually going to drag them to the pieces you want grouped. So if you wanted to do this, a lot of people will do this based on material preferences. So all your cloth materials are in one group, all your metals are in another, because then you can isolate those pieces. With a full character, sometimes you want a little bit more finite control, like I did the upper clothing versus lower clothing. But all you're doing is making non-redshift, just basic materials, and you're making a flat color and naming it whatever you want. And when you export that FBX out, and bring it into Substance, it's actually going to recognize those as texture sets where you can then organize those groups. And when you go into baking with the high poly, so if we go to, let's see, edit, project configuration. So if you actually selected like a new high poly mesh here in the baking tab, I have one high poly of the entire character exported. It's all merged together. But since we have these texture sets, you can actually hide groups and then tell it to basically only look at those individual sets to bake. And so you can actually go into, if you notice this thing which we skipped over before, it says match, and you can change it. It defaults to always, but if you change it to by mesh name, now this one isn't perfect because I'm missing the high poly, but if you come down here, it's going to tell, remember when I talked about the underscore low, underscore high? What this is doing is if you have a bunch of meshes and they all have low and high, if the names match, it's going to essentially look at each one individually, but it's going to do it based on texture sets. So you can isolate, and that's how I was able to bake the headphones and not have the ambient occlusion pass go underneath the head. Like, this is getting a little bit more into the high end of the character pipeline, but that's how you can get really clean AO bakes without having to separate everything and bake it and recombine it. This can all be done on one character combined, but just working a little smarter, right? And I think we're running low on time here. So that's really all I had on the demo stuff. I did want to show just a little snippet of like, his head has changed quite a bit on this character, and I've actually been, the next step is, this is like a little, like, you know, you saw this in the demo, but this is when I was doing an initial test in Unreal. I just brought him in on the third person thing. You can see some weight painting issues on the vest. But really quickly, this was me taking that character and then just dumping the textures onto it, and now I had like a nice quick demo to kind of play around with him. And it's a good way to kind of do this early on because I was able to see a bunch of issues with the vest and the weight painting, and you know, if we had more time, I could show you how to do this. It's very easy on Unreal side. You're just swapping your character out for the third person demo. And then I'm also, if I can get out of this, and I'm working on rigging him right now and doing his face controls. This is an older version. It's changed quite a bit now, but this was kind of like when we were trying to play with the idea of making him have organic shapes with hard surface stuff at the same time. So I'm kind of in the R&D of this right now, but you can see if we skip ahead a little bit, you know, we got the kind of full IK on the fingers and everything. So I've been learning all this the last like 5 months or so, been doing the whole rigging journey. And this is an update from this week, actually, where his design of his face has changed quite a bit, and so his jaw. So this is a great example of if you want to work in characters, and this is something I'm learning, I don't normally take it through the full pipeline. I don't normally rig my own stuff. You learn really quickly what doesn't work with how you sculpted it or how you made it with the polys. And this was something, this is a great example of where I had to remake his face, essentially, because the animation was not working. So this was a fun problem I solved by making his neck have this kind of accordion fabric, and that's just weight painted by hand, and then it's just mapped to that bone in his mouth, and then he has a visor, can fully rotate, everything like that. That's just a little bonus of what I'm actually working on tomorrow and trying to finish up. So this will all transfer over to Control Rig and Unreal, and we're trying to, you know, we'll have to rebuild some of that stuff. But yeah, that's what I've been doing. Hopefully I know I had to go through a lot of that really fast. I'm happy to nerd out about this stuff. Just grab me and I'll talk more. Yeah, that's all I got though. Thank you. Yeah, you can find me here again. I'm at Steve Teeple on every website. Just, I answer DMs a lot, so just let me nerd out. Yeah.
Excellent job, brother. Excellent job. Let's hear it for Steve one more time. Big round of applause.
Yeah.
And we do have time because he's our last presenter of the day, but don't worry, we have more tomorrow. I know, Internet, don't shut off yet because there's questions.
We can do Q&A. Yeah.
We have Q&A. There's probably your question could be answered. I know I should look at the chat, but I'm not going to do that.
I didn't look at the camera enough. I realized they're there. Sorry. Hello.
Yes. Hi. Yes. All of the Internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, questions for Steve. Not everybody at once, only one at a time.
I'm sure not that many people have questions. It's a lot.
You, James Ramirez, what's your question? Could you do a cloth sim?
Yeah. He was asking about doing sims on the clothing or something. In Unreal or just in general? Or in Unreal, yeah, you could take that and do the Chaos Cloth engine inside of Unreal, and it would basically like have that. We're doing that on his straps on his pants, actually. So like we have it where those pants straps are going to follow automatically and have physics. One thing I'll say about Unreal is there's no cache simulations. So if you want to do cloth simming, it is all hit play and hope it works. So that's something I had to learn as well because it's very video game focused. So there's no like how you would do it with Marvelous, with an Alembic. You could bring that in. But if you want to do it on a character, yeah. Just gotta.
Can you weight that differently though?
Yeah,
it does all the weighting for the cloth sim.
Yeah, and so that's Unreal actually has like a cloth weight kind of. You basically draw like a black and white gradient of where you want it affected. I will admit it's not the most refined tool, and I think normally I will do that in another app and then bring it over as a map. But you can paint it in Unreal directly. Yeah. So
cool.
Yeah. Anyone else?
More questions right here, Rob. So the question is...
Of course, Rob asked about aces.
Rob asked about aces in Substance.
So my one experience, which I think I've joked to Rob about, is I've learned that I think games, Substance actually will default to the color space of aces for game maps. I tried it on a project more recently, and it's a matter of the people you're working with knowing that those maps are in that format and actually setting up their engine to work with it. I will say... I've not had people using ACES quite yet in my workflow, but I tried. I almost got him, but it ends up being a little dark if you don't know how to render it properly. So, yeah.
Like Batman Dark, or?
Yeah. Less evil, just really high contrast, maybe, or something.
Great. Any other questions for Steve?
You can ask me after too if you're embarrassed. That's
awesome.
Fine.
Yeah, if he'll be around. I think we only have a half hour left in the day.
Yeah.
But we will be back tomorrow starting 10:30 bright and early here after your coffee with our next presenter of the day. Thank you. Big round of applause for all of our presenters. Day 1. We will catch you day 2 at SIGGRAPH here at the Maxon booth. Have a great night. See you tomorrow, Internet.
I keep forgetting.